These have been a peaceful couple of years on the international affairs side of things. The United States took steps to limit immigration. With the Emergency Quota Act, quotas were set so that only a certain amount of people could come into the United States. With the Red Scare, the U.S. attempted to keep communism and socialism out of the country. We no longer needed to be involved with foreign wars or affairs, as seen with us not approving the Treaty of Versailles or joining the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created to diplomatically solve international affairs to hopefully prevent future wars, and it was proposed by Wilson. Before World War I, foreigners invested more money in the United States than America invested in other countries, about $3 billion more. The war changed this. By 1919, Americans had almost $3 billion more invested in other countries than foreign citizens had invested in the United States. Hoover and Roosevelt began to change their way of thinking with these policies. Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy, which formally renounced the U.S. armed intervention with the affairs of Latin America. The United States also began trading agreements with nations in Latin America. FDR adopted policies that reduced American domination of Latin America diplomatic affairs while still providing economic assistance and greatly increasing America's popularity in the region. American investment in Latin America grew from 1.3 million to 3.5 billion in 1929. American exports also increased substantially. The U.S. trained National Guard helped protect pro-American leaders, several of whom were dictators. American foreign investments are continuing to increase greatly during the 1920s. Increasing foreign investments was not the only sign of growing American economic power. By the end of World War I, the United States produced more goods and services than any other nation, both in total and in person. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 set a ratio of naval tonnage among the 5 leading naval nations in the attempt to limit naval arrangements. Participating also agreed not to build new bases in the Pacific. The Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, General Treaty for the Renouncement of War, United States, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and a number of other states. The pact renounced aggressive war, prohibiting the use of war as a national policy, except in matters of self-defense.
The Band-Aid was invented by Earl Dixon in 1921. The lie detector, or the modern polygraph system that sensed reactions to tell whether a person was lying or telling the truth, was invented by John A. Larson in 1921. The traffic light was invented by Garrett Morgan after he saw 2 vehicles crash into each other in 1923. The audiometer, which was used for evaluating hearing loss, was invented by Dr. Harvey Fletcher of Brigham Young University in 1922. The automatic watch was invented by John Harwood in 1923, which had a self-winding mechanism. The loudspeaker system was invented by Chester Rice and Edward Kellogg in 1924. The television was invented in 1925 by John Logie Baird. The garage door opener was invented in 1926 by C.G. Johnson. The first commercial bread slicing machine was invented by an American inventor and engineer, Otto Frederick Roentgen, in 1927. The sunglasses were invented by Sam Foster in 1929. American Frank Offutt invented the steam pressure washer to clean buildings, automobiles, and concrete surfaces in 1927. The electric razor was invented by Jacob Schnick in 1928. This convenient form of shaving did not require the use of water or shaving cream. The instant camera was invented in 1923 by a man named Samuel Schlafrock. The garbage disposal was invented in 1927 by John W. Hams. This was a machine that shredded food waste into little pieces. Frozen food was invented in 1929 by a man named Clarence Birdseye.
The 20s were known as the Roaring Twenties because of how many things changed during the time and how much culture was spreading. That was not the only thing. There was a lot of new inventions that occurred during the 20s. Though there was a lot of good things, there was also a lot of bad things. During this time, since many things changed, there was a lot of social problems. It all started with the 18th Amendment was ratified. January 16, 1920 was the date that every tavern was closed in the United States. Even though all the taverns closed, that did not stop people from transporting alcohol underground and buying it illegally. This was a big problem for the government because they did not know who was selling the alcohol, and many powerful people came from this happening, like Chicago gangster Al Capone. People like Al Capone were a big problem for the U.S. government because they had so many people backing them, and it was hard for the government to get them. That was not the only thing that was a big problem in the 1920s. One of the major problems was immigration in the United States. In 1920, more than 430,000 people immigrated to the United States, and that number increased to 800,000 in 1921. Many people were against them moving to the States because it was harder for them to get jobs, and that was a big problem because they needed money to feed their families. That was not the only problem. Since many people were immigrating from different places, a new Ku Klux Klan was formed, but this one focused more on foreigners than blacks. With the increasing population and diversity that the United States was starting to have, there came a lot more religious beliefs. That was a good and bad thing because it expanded our learning and helped us understand other people in the world. But it's a bad thing because it's putting a lot of eyes on those that follow the religion that is not customary in the U.S. Many people thought that these new religions and beliefs were attacking the church, and they believe sooner or later those beliefs will pass the church and their beliefs. Even though many immigrants were coming to the United States, women still demanded the right to vote, and on August 21st, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and this allowed women the right to vote. This was a big problem because some people were not very happy that they were allowed to vote, because men believed that they were still more of a necessity than women, and they should not be treated equally. In some aspect of the daily life, men were still getting more things than the women, like better pay. Even though women were not getting the same pay, they were happy because they were working outside the house.
What's up, guys? My name is Michael Mardo, and I'm here to tell you about culture in the 1920s.
The 1920s was a decade of change in America. For the first time ever, more people were living in cities than on farms. The United States' total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. People from both coasts bought the same goods. This is because of new chains, which meant all people were buying the same products from the same companies all over the country. Americans listened to the same music, did the same dances, and mostly even used the same slang. A lot of Americans weren't a fan of the 1920s with all the changes that was going along with this decade. Prohibition was a serious event to start off the 1920s. During the 1920s, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution had banned the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors, and at 12 a.m. on January 16, 1920, the act closed every tavern, bar, and saloon in the United States. From then on, it was illegal to sell any alcoholic beverages with more than 0.5% alcohol. This drove the liquor trade to underground business. People simply went to illegal speakeasies instead of the ordinary bars, where it was controlled by bootleggers, racketeers, and other organized crime figures. The Jazz Age came to life in the 1920s. What many young people wanted to do in the 1920s was dance. Some of these dances were the Charleston, the Cakewalk, the Black Bottom, and the Flea Hop. Jazz bands played at dance halls such as in New York City and Chicago. The radio stations and phonograph records carried their tunes to listeners across the nation. Some older people objected to jazz music's vulgarity, but many in the younger generations loved the freedom they felt on the dance floor. Women's style was a big change in the 1920s. The most familiar symbol of the Roaring Twenties is probably the flapper, which was a young woman with bobbed hair and short skirts who drank, smoked, and said what might be termed unladylike things. In reality, most young women in the 1920s did none of these things, but even those women who were not flappers gained some new freedoms. Women, finally able to vote thanks to the 19th Amendment of the Constitution that had guaranteed that right in the 1920s. Millions of women worked in white-collar jobs and could afford to participate in the consumer economy. The increased availability of birth control devices made it possible for women to have fewer children, and new machines and technologies like the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner eliminated some of the hard and boring work of the household.